Welcome to Live Healthy Longer, Professor Lorraine Besser.
Thank you, James. I'm really excited to be here.
Now, you make an interesting comment that people are so often fixated on pleasure. But let's talk about the term happiness. Now, happiness can have different meanings to each of us, and often it can be an elusive, shall we say, pursuit. How you envision happiness?
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned, we use happiness in so many different ways. I think it's really important. We can use the word however we want, but I also think it's really important to be clear about how we're using the word, especially if we want to increase our happiness. And so, one of the things that the way I approach happiness is to follow along with the way that happiness is studied within the empirical sciences, which is where they take happiness to be this state, this very discrete state marked by positive affect and pleasure.
So
And this
now we're
drops
talking
this.
about a scientific approach, correct? As opposed to, just coming off the line of being happy. This is actual science speaking.
Yeah, yeah. And so empirically, right, it's really important to have a really well described object that you are studying. And I think that there is what we find within discussions of happiness is that there is this distance between the longer term, broader sense of happiness that we use all the time in ordinary language and what gets studied and called happiness within the sciences. And so I find it more helpful to think about happiness as one part of the good life. And so one of several things that we ought to be pursuing. And other things that we ought to pursue include meaningfulness and interestingness. And oftentimes, the broad sense of happiness includes these tones, right? We often hear about authentic happiness or something like that. And again, that's fine. But what the real key important thing is for us to be able to really know what it is, which sense is being used. Otherwise, how are we supposed to know whether what we're reading about or the information we're getting is really relevant for our pursuits and interests?
That's important. Your first book on the subject, which is called The Philosophy of Happiness, it actually reawakened a long-standing philosophical question. Can happiness really be measured or, for that matter, successfully pursued? So can you describe, and I use the term basics, can you describe the basics you convey about happiness?
Yeah. So in that book, what I do is explore uh, basic fundamental philosophical understandings of happiness, which certainly precede the scientific research on it. And then I consider what we've learned about happiness from the various disciplines that have now begun studying it. And I found that there were similar issues raised throughout interdisciplinary research. One of them is that happiness, again, studied as the state of positive affect, is very short-lived state. And so that when we get it and we experience it, right, we experience it as something really good and we want it to continue, of course. Yet our physiology is such that it naturally adapts to these high levels of sensation. And so it really makes the pursuit of this kind of sustained happiness a really elusive kind of goal for us.
Well, you mentioned short term, which is interesting, I think, in a sense, because short term, does that mean it's kind of like a high? We're on a short high, and then all of a sudden we come down off that high. Is that what you're talking about?
It's parallel, yeah, yeah. So if we think about, the positive affect or pleasurable states, right? They really describe this kind of this high, right? This kind of way of experiencing that is marked by these higher levels of good feelings. But as most of us know, good feelings come down, right? It's not um, it's just not part of our system to be experiencing these increased states of pleasure at all times. One way I like to think about pleasure and happiness is really as a reward, right? So pleasure originates physiologically as the reward for that crop that kicks in to kind of reward us for doing the things that we are supposed to be doing, right? Eating feels really good, And it feels good because we get a sense of pleasure that rewards us for nourishing our body. But in order to function as a reward, right, the feeling has to go away. We can't eat once and then be good forever, right? We have to eat once, get rewarded when we do it, and then that feeling has to go away in order to motivate us to do it again. So by its nature, pleasure, these senses of positive affect, they operate as this reward systems that, originate by doing what things we're supposed to be doing. They've expanded, of course, since then, but fundamentally they are physiologically wired in this same sense. They're rewards, and for rewards to work, right, they can't last forever.
So I guess how can we enjoy the highs unless we also experience the lows is really what it boils down to. And the reward, of course, gives us that high, but then we've got to work at it, don't we?
Yeah, yeah. So the reward gives us the high, and then we return to some kind of whatever our default state is. But when it fades away, we should just remind ourselves that that's expected, and really just be okay with that. There are other ways that we can enhance our lives, and there are other ways to add things that will satisfy us and that we'll find enjoyable that go beyond just these pleasant sources of pleasure.
So are you also saying that perhaps we should just enjoy contentment, being content with who we are, where we are, and obviously experience those highs, but be content with the rest of our life, even though it may not be constant highs?
Yeah, yeah. And I think certainly, I mean, I worry about too much of a blanket endorsement of contentment, because I think there is a lot that we can do to enhance our current situations. I just don't think pursuing pleasure is going to be our best bet to enhance our current situations. So I think we should be content in the sense that we have experiences of pleasure and they go away, and we should be okay with that, right? I definitely worry about punishing ourselves or feeling that there's something wrong with us when our happiness fades away. There's nothing wrong with us. That's just part of how it works. And the more that we can accept that and recognize it, then the less hard on ourselves we'll be, and the more that we can find space to do other things that'll enhance our lives and deliver us to us a good life.
I like it. In any case, your latest book, by the way, which is, as you know, getting rave reviews, is called The Art of Interesting. Now, of course, interesting means different things to different people. What does it mean to you?
I see interestingness as just as important as pleasure. Both describe the quality of a certain range of experiences, and both are really important in our lives. And we haven't talked that much about the interesting, and so that's what I'm here to do.
So, but if we find something interesting, does that mean we're happy that we found something interesting and therefore we're in a state of happiness? Or does interesting mean something provocative? It means something else other than happiness? Or do they both coincide?
Yeah. So I think that the interesting is certainly different and distinct from happiness understood as a state of positive affect. And part of my research originated within collaborative work I did with a psychologist, Shigehiro Oshii, who became interested in the question of whether or not our current ways of understanding the good life, which is in terms of happiness or meaning or some combination of those, whether those really exhausted all there is to a good life. And so we began working on this project, studying this concept or developing the concept of psychological richness and trying to understand what it is and why it's really important to us. And one of the things, first and most important things we found was that psychological richness, this state, is distinct from happiness and meaning. And what that essentially means for us is that where we don't find happiness, or where happiness is really not kicking in, perhaps because we're experiencing complex emotions, we can still have valuable experiences that are rewarding and that enhance our lives. And those are the interesting experiences. What we know about psychologically rich states is that their nature is such that they really arise under conditions of challenge, complexity, and novelty. And these are all conditions that trigger this robust form of cognitive engagement Yet also notice they're not all situations where positive feelings are always flowing. Gosh, one of my favorite examples because is also it generates painful feelings for me, but I will share it. So thinking about snakes for me, like I am really scared of snakes, and I'm not scared of many things, but snakes I'm really scared of. And so I can think about snakes and be actually really interested in thinking about them. Where I live in Vermont, we're across the lake from a place where there are rattlesnakes in the mountains. And there's a lot of folklore about these rattlesnakes, right? Such as that they follow these boundaries. So, like, they go only to a certain point around the mountain, but they don't cross over any certain lines. There's also people who have claimed to see them swim. And I find this kind of these stories about these rattlesnakes very interesting to think about, right? How can a snake follow a boundary? How can a snake swim? Right? All of these things I find really interesting to think about. Yet they also generate within me very complex, difficult emotions, right? Like I sometimes when I think about it, I can find myself physically shaking, right? So I'm engaged in this state that is definitely not pleasurable, right? But it's really interesting, and it's a place that I want to be in, even though it makes me shake and have uncomfortable feelings.
Right? So you find snakes interesting, but you're not happy when you're around them. That's what it really
Yes,
boils
yes.
down to. I don't
Nor
blame
am
you.
I happy
I
when I'm
share
thinking
that
about them.
myself. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
share that myself. I don't know what it is about snakes, and I don't think it's biblical, but when I see one, it scares me if it's coming towards me. It really does. I know that I can probably, handle the situation. But yes, I found them very interesting, what they do, the different types, varieties. So yeah, I do see the difference. Very good point. One interesting term that you've been using, this term, and I'd really like to get into it a little bit because I know it's a predominant point in your book, The Art of Interesting. It's psychological richness. Now, tie it in or explain what this means in relationship to happiness. I mean, do they equate? Psychological richness can, I think you're saying things that are interesting, but that doesn't necessarily mean it equates to happiness. Uh, do they exist together or are they separate entities?
They're separate entities. So again, working with this conception of happiness where it is a state marked by positive affect, right? That's the dominant field, that's the dominant distinguishing marker of a state of being of happiness. And that is something that psychological richness, right? Having being marked by positive affect, right? Sometimes, you can have psychologically rich experiences that are pleasant, but you also can have them that are not pleasant. And so I think they occupy very different ways of living in ways that benefit us, right? So I tend to think of it in terms of our kind of overall what we're after in terms of the good life, right? And within the good life, I think happiness and psychological richness play very different roles.
So, in your book, The Art of Interesting, you say something I find a bit fascinating. You say, you discuss what we're missing in the pursuit of the good life. Can you tell us what we're missing?
I think we're missing psychological richness.
So, I want to enhance my psychological richness. What suggestions do you have where I can focus on that particular goal?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so the way to go about thinking about how you can really develop more psychological richness within your lives is to really think about the conditions that it's correlated with and then to put yourself in those conditions, right? So it's not the kind of thing that we can plan to pursue directly, right? Because that takes away all of the interesting parts of it. But what we can do is look at the research. So here's what we know that psychological richness is primarily correlated with. So it crops up in situations of novelty, complexity, and challenge. So we can develop more psychological richness in our lives by allowing ourselves to be in challenging positions and seeking out the complexity in the world, and also by seeking out novelty or discovering novelty around us.
Should we be reading more? Should we be watching a little bit more PBS than on television, as opposed to watching these serials that we have that are shoot 'em ups and all of that? I mean, are we going in the wrong direction as a society where we're focusing on the wrong things rather than enriching our minds? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think there is that sense in which, as a society, we do tend to focus on the wrong things. But I also really believe, and I think you started out with this, right? That what each person finds interesting is very unique and specific to them. Huh? And so I'm hesitant to say that there's one thing, like start reading more, or finding, find a documentaries. These are all sources, potential sources of psychologically rich experiences. But it also depends on what's really activating the individual.
Good point. Now, there's something you mentioned in your book that's interesting. Because we face daily obstacles, things that really bother us, things that challenge us. You mentioned in your book turning obstacles into adventures. Can you explain that?
Yeah, yeah. So obstacle, like thinking about something in terms of an obstacle, it really just shuts you down, right? You put all these expectations on it, these bad expectations, and it's really gonna, close off any possibilities for you. But if you stop just seeing it as an obstacle and instead just bring openness to it, see what happens, then you'll be more apt to have a psychologically rich experience.
So, is this by any chance where the power of positive thinking comes in? Let's say an older adult who's facing with some serious illnesses or medical challenges, so to speak. As we age, obviously, more things come into our life that become obstacles, really big obstacles. So, the utilization of the positive thinking approach, is this helpful in those situations?
The positive thinking approach, it certainly can be helpful, right? But I think ought to be really aware of the potential for toxic positivity to creep in. And by that, I mean a form of positivity that really refuses to acknowledge the challenge itself, right? So there's a way in which we can interact, and it's a tempting way, and it's always motivated by a great place, where we think it'll be more helpful for a person to just not think about the challenges, or to say that, no, it's actually not that bad, and what really we can think of it this way, or even just like for people to engage with people with someone who's suffering and not even recognize that suffering because we think that'll hurt them somehow. We think that being positive will help them somehow. I think that approach can be very hurtful to someone who is suffering, right? If someone's suffering, we need to recognize their suffering. We
Need
don't
to
want
acknowledge it and
we
take
need to
whatever
acknowledge it.
required to overcome the obstacle.
Yeah, yeah. We need to see it first, right? And you know, we don't want to erase it for them. If they're suffering, they probably, they can't erase their challenges, and suggesting that they do is I think it can be problematic.
I understand. So, in conclusion, Dr. Besser, let's get back to the theme of the theme of happiness. Uh, can you summarize your vision of achieving happiness on a daily basis? I mean, what's required to achieve happiness to keep life interesting?
Yeah. So I think that on a daily basis, what we can do is really be aware and more conscious of what we're experiencing. So simply by being aware of, when we feel positive affect blooming, right? And then to let it go, right? And be really experience it in the moment as it comes. Uh, Likewise, I think we can really pay attention to things that are stimulating our minds and allow that to happen and allow psychological richness to develop out of that. And reminding ourselves of when we're stuck and that, there are moments, even when you have a pressing deadline, you're still driving to work. You can look around your environment as you drive to work and take in something new, bring some curiosity to it, have an interesting experience. You haven't done anything different. You haven't really sacrificed any real mission or plan, but you've given yourself a moment to really enjoy and experience something that is rewarding.
You've opened your eyes and your mind.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Well, Dr. Besser, I want to thank you for sharing such enlightening information. It really has been about happiness, about what's interesting. And to our listeners, I'll be right back to talk about foods that can keep us happy.